Thank you, Dennis. Just continue. I would like to welcome you all to Coaches for Good February webinar. We are so thrilled and happy to have our amazing speaker today, Sarah Drijfhout. Sarah comes from 25 years background in corporate, where she worked in sales and technology. And today she's gonna talk to us about the new book, Gender Dimensions in Leadership. Sarah, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
So, I would like to start the session probably learning more about you. Who is Sarah? Sarah the author, Sarah the coach, Sarah the mother, the wife, the successful career woman.
Okay. Well, that's funny. That's a great leading question. Actually, not for the reason you think of. Yeah, actually, it always troubles me when I think, oh, am I supposed to put on all these identities now? None of which particularly sit well with me. So I don't think of myself as any of those things, even though I am all of those things.
No problem. You can describe yourself with your own words without labels.
Yeah. No, but the point being, yeah, yeah, isn't it funny how we sort of need to it's a lot of what the book's about, how we kind of need to identify ourselves or think we need to identify ourselves with certain things or certain labels or identify other people. But yeah, I as you said, Meisha, I came from the corporate world. I worked in international business development for a long time, and a lot of those, they were very male dominated areas. And sales is anyway, it's less so now. So I was initially in medical devices, and I was working in the operating theatre. So a lot of strong egos there, surgeons, nurses, and then moved out of that area into tech sales and software, working for a variety of American companies selling clinical research software, actually. So, yeah, that was, I guess, an eye-opening experience, and what it obviously very people orientated, and a lot of interesting observations in how people work and what's successful and what was not, and how my colleagues worked, and obviously a lot of insight there into how bias can happen and what things can happen there. So I had that career. I moved into executive coaching a few years back. Also, before that, I should mention I left the corporate world altogether, just be and I shouldn't say the word just at all, not at all, to be home with family and start my own family. And that was fascinating. That switch. That what was very fascinating was how from one day to the next, I had not changed at all, but the people perceptions of me changed utterly, which was a great indicator of just how sort of extreme bias and the labeling can be. So, you know, whilst I was working, I was seen as this sort of high-flying career woman, which also didn't really sit with my identity. And then becoming mother, I think people immediately assumed that I could never have possibly done anything except being sort of really bumbling along through life. So it was interesting to have these observations at quite extremes, and it got me thinking a lot about, you know, gender and leadership and how we take responsibility, how we label people, and the psychological effects that that can have. And when I started to come back into the corporate world, I'd done a couple of courses on women's leadership. So I was fascinated to learn why it is that leadership is seen as incongruent for women, but not for men, and how this ties into the difficulties we have with reaching equality, and why it also ties into why it's quite difficult oftentimes for companies and for people to sort of be inclusive, behave inclusively, and treat people in an inclusive way, in such a way that people feel they belong. You know, very often in my career, obviously people expected far less of me than what I actually produced, and then they were always kind of like taken aback, like, how could this be? And I just found that observation, you know, fascinating, and you know, you witness it happening to other people, how these assumptions that people make about people and what talent they apparently have or have not based on either gender or other labels. So there were a lot of things going on there that made me very intrigued about the whole subject. So I did a lot of research. As I'd moved into executive coaching, I actually interviewed a lot of executive leaders because I was fascinated by this idea of why don't we have more female leaders? What is that all about? So I interviewed many, and what came out of that research was women had 1,000 different stories about that, and men really had only three, and those three were: women aren't confident, women have babies, women don't want those roles anyway. And so it was, it was interesting to see this bias taking place as well, and how little apparently the average male understood about what women want from careers and leadership and all the rest of it, and why women had so very different stories and obviously had experienced a lot of bias and so on. So, and then I went about writing the book, and the book is really designed to get much deeper, because one of the things that struck me as we go into this topic about women's leadership is, first of all, it puts a lot of not just men but also women off. It personally put me off, because back to that original point, Nisa, is how do we identify? And even though obviously I'm a woman, I'm biologically a woman, and I know that apparently means certain things to certain people. So I probably don't identify particularly readily. And this is something we need to bear in mind when we talk about, how do we include people? And this topic of women's leadership, which a lot of the push behind it is all about, oh, women are amazing, and, women should be ruling the world, and this sort of rhetoric that, frankly, I'm sure every one of us would recognize. Yeah, we've had good and bad leaders, and they've been male and female, and that's sexist and biased in itself to make these kind of strong statements. So this book was designed to really educate people on the deeper psychology behind what sexism really is, because sexism isn't just something that happens to women. Sexism happens to everybody. Psychological distress and psychological safety and space is something everybody needs. And so it was a motivation to make much clearer what really are the issues, and that they can't be these kind of broad brush statements that we throw away thinking they don't do any harm when they do a great deal of harm. And I think the current rhetoric around women, a lot of it is not helpful. Some of it is fantastic, but a lot of it actually continues this sort of sexism that's going on, which surely we want to get away from. So yeah, it's a long-winded, I tend to answer in very long-winded ways. Apologies, everyone.
We're gonna keep it spontaneous. And I just want, I read the book and I enjoyed it, and I tried to pick few things. I don't want to spoil, the rest for other people, because I want everyone to read the book. But as you mentioned, it's important to engage and include. And I'm curious to know what is missing. What are women like? What is holding women back?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think lots of things hold women back. I would strongly challenge that many of them are coming from women, and that's what and what I mean by that, they're not coming from women, and it's nothing that women lack. Particularly, we have this conversation, for instance, around, oh, women don't have confidence, and this is what I heard all the time from men and from some other women. Women don't have confidence, and I don't think that's true. I think, if you live in if you experience a lot of sexism, it has a big impact on you, right? Just as we know, if people are experiencing racism, it has a massive impact on them. We talk about black and brown trauma. We talk trauma. We talk about, sexism as a form of trauma. If you're used to sexist things happening, it tends to wear people down. And so what's more the case is, questions of self-esteem sometimes, and questions of second guessing all the time. Well, how do I need to perform today so that I'm going to apparently either please people or not offend people, and it comes back to this idea in leadership, because really this book is about leadership. And this idea that, and the research shows this, is that for women, leadership is incongruent. So by showing up as a female who's trying to take responsibility and show leadership, two things happen. Well, basically, we don't like that. As a culture, we don't seem to accept that readily in women. We will naturally gravitate to males as leaders. And this is kind of historical and cultural. No, it's not biological, and I can go into that later. It's much more historical and cultural. And then if we do have female leaders, and often two things happen. She'll either be liked but not respected, or she'll be respected but not liked. And we call this the double bind. And this, I'm sure all you ladies have experienced. There's times when you've stepped up and been strong and probably stepped on somebody's toes along the line, or somebody's not liked it. And times when you've tried to be the pleaser and the likable one, and then you have more difficulties, you know, having gravitas and having the kind of the respect that you need to get the job done. And this happens a lot of the time. And so what happens over time is a lot of women get sort of ground down by that constant kind of battle between these two places. And other things, of course, are happening in the corporate world or wherever, in terms of where our place is supposed to be and not be, and how much we're supposed to be outspoken and so on. So there's lots of things going on that that affect women and impact women and hold women back. But a lot of them are sort of rather systems based than you know, per se an inherent thing in women, which I think is not a good place for us to be. Now, that doesn't mean that women don't need bolstering and giving support and lifting up. They absolutely do. But it's not because we somehow lack something. We have to make up for it. It has much more to do with, yeah, over time that confidence can be damaged, and it is a constant battle sometimes. And so on the other side of this, obviously, the behaviors that come out in social context, and we're specifically talking about a lot of the corporate and work context in the book, is, you know, these assumptions around, you know, first impressions, or female, therefore not leader, or gravitating towards the male and leader, and so on. So all these things come into play as well. And we just know there is a lot of bias, unconscious bias, that just happens, that leads to all these other things going on. So inequality in leadership roles, massive pay gaps, discrepancy in who gets the seniority, and all sorts of other things.
Yeah. What needs to change on individual level or organization level? I understand this is the
Yeah.
issue. So
I think what's one of the, sorry, Mike.
what needs to be changed?
I think one of the key things, it seems to be, you know, women have to fight for women still, and that's a lot of what the women's rhetoric is. You know, look now, we've got Dennis who's blotted out with his photo, and we've got lots of ladies here, which is lovely, but isn't this the problem? And specifically, this book is to engage men. It's endorsed by a ton of men. I interviewed everybody, but I specifically targeted lots of men. Because as some of us women are turned off by the conversation, of course, most men are turned off because they also think, well, it's not our conversation. He's back. It's not our conversation, or it's not about us, or we don't know what to do. And the whole point is, well, like any of these inclusive discussions, whether it's racism or sexism or all sorts of isms that are going on, it needs to be an inclusive conversation because it affects us all. Equality is not something for women. Equality is for everybody, because when we have equality, societies and communities thrive. We know that. The World Health Organization will tell you this, and it's one of their leading prerogatives. The World Economic Forum will tell you this, is one of their leading prerogatives. The United Nations will tell you this, is one of the sustainable goals. We know that when we have equality, be it in education, in science, in medicine, or in the corporate world, or in leadership roles, great things happen in society. It's in everybody's interest. If you think, you know, logically, we're representing the population, so we need to have everybody representing it, be it by gender or race, or, you know, all sorts of other intersections going on. So the really crucial thing, Maisha, I think, is, yeah, we have to have men involved. We have to have everybody involved in this discussion. It needs to be an inclusive discussion. And I think that's why I called it gender dimensions in leadership, because all of these dimensions impact every single person. And leadership, I think we have gendered leadership to our detriment, which also leads to us oftentimes choosing the wrong leaders. And whilst we gender leadership, we tend to go for this, going back to the confidence, we tend to go for confidence above competence. And again, there's a very famous study done every year at Stanford that they do on students. And invariably, every single year, they split the groups, they allocate them the leader who's the expert. And we know that expert leaders are the best leaders because they know the subject and they lead it well. But what invariably happens is halfway through the study, the group, when they're presented with how they're doing on the project, half of them will get rid of that expert leader and reassign a more confident, loud, usually white individual as the leader, who invariably does far worse. And this is, by the way, this is no attack on white male leaders. This book is very much supportive of men who are often ostracized in this conversation and blamed when it's only some men that are everybody else's issue, right? And men and women. And this is the other point, is that if we selected, humility and competence, we would also select more readily the right men and the right women. So the reason I come at it from a leadership point of view is, we characterize ourselves, we characterize each other. Who is Sarah? I don't know what you meant by that, Maisa, so I'm just using it as an example. And we characterize leaderships and lots of other things. And I'm sure we all have very different a set of what we believe are successful traits to make a leader that's effective in our eyes, and that's the point. But what we tend to do, in the corporate world, there's this culture of, and the culture is obviously changing, but historically, fairly rapidly, recently still, it's been a culture of power, money, and less about humility, competence, and expertise. So the short answer is, we need men in the conversation. We need as many men as women, and that's what the book and the course is all about. And you know what? Men love this because they love being invited. And we know from the research that all these women's networks in some of the major corporations, we know now that they're great for women to a large degree, although they're quite exclusive of some women who, again, don't buy into whatever this definition of women is supposed to be. But they do silo out men. They do exclude men, and so they actually have a fairly negative impact on creating more equality in companies. So where men are invited into those networks, it's actually far better for improving, women's access to, senior roles, leadership, and all the rest of it.
Sarah, we've got a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat. Claudia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, now I'm like, I don't know with which one to start.
Either.
Term before, system-based. And I would like to understand from you, to know from you, what do you mean by that? I've heard it many, many times, that in many, many different occasions, and like you said, by women's specifically, or by minority group who talk about the systemic problems, the system-based issues. So I'm trying to understand, where are you coming from when you say system-based? That's my
point. It is a really tedious term that we throw around a lot, but what we're talking about is, we've got the issue for the individual, and the issue for the individuals, we have to accept all the research. So we see stories every day, and I'm sure you all ladies, and Dennis too, by the way, we've all experienced bias, we've all experienced stereotyping and how it can negatively impact us. Because of our gender or because of our color or a ton of other things. So that's on the individual level, and it has a greater or lesser impact depending on what is going on, all sorts of things there. And then we have the system stuff, which is sort of in its simplest level. You go to a company and you may not get through the first round of CVs because your name's a bit weird and it's already out. It's like, oh, Mohammed, blah, blah, blah. Well, we don't want that. We want Natasha's and Simon's, so I mean that's it. And it's really base form, but that sort of level of bias is occurring, and that's corporate world is becoming more aware of this stuff. So and then going through the CVs and then getting the people in front of equitable recruitment panels, and then the bias around, well, how much do we like them? How much do we like her? And all the other things that are going. So from the recruitment point onwards, it's already become an issue. It's already a systems issue. And because that bias pervades in all sorts of unconscious ways, whether we like it or not, we all have it, and we all make decisions based on that, about who we like, who fits. You know, this, I'm really amazed that corporate still throw this word around, well, you weren't a good fit for us. It's like, you really, if you knew anything about D&I work, that is a term you never use. What does that even mean? We shouldn't be looking for people who fit. We should be looking for people who challenge us and have another perspective and can do the job. So it's systems in terms of that recruitment process at the beginning, Claudia, and it's right the way through to who's being mentored, who's being sponsored, have we got a succession plan? Do we have men and women in the succession plan, and other minorities? You know, what goals do we have here? What is our customer base? Who are we targeting? Who are we marketing to? And so the system is everywhere where there's bias popping up, consciously or unconsciously. That's where the system is failing, because I would assume, are all hopeful that we're working to a world where there is equality, because we recognize that everybody has talent, everybody should have opportunity, everybody should have right to the same pay if they're doing the same job. Everybody should have right to the same status, the same senior positions, the same succession, the same pension, the same care leave rather than parental leave. You know, these things should be equal, because as soon as we start to split them up, or we give her because she's had a baby, or, you know, everybody, there's lots of people, just as an example, the care leave is another example here, Claudia. So again, it's a systems thing. It's great that, of course, women go off and have babies, and they should be covered for that and be able to come back and return. At the same time, there are lots of people who don't go have babies, and they do other things. They care for elderly parents, or they may be looking after a disabled system. And so having provisions in place where they also get care leave, so that they can come back, you know, and take time out. So it's an example, you know, flexibility. I mean, the corporate world has been thrown well and truly into understanding now that, wow, gee, flexibility could be something that we all need. Who would have thought that we all actually need it? We all can work part-time, and we all need to be supported to be able to work from home, because guess what's happening? You know, again, we see the inequality, those who can and those who cannot work from home, and how all of these things also come into play. So systems is kind of all that stuff, the structure behind the initial individual bias that's actually prolific throughout what we do as organizations and groups of people. And it's in any system. You know, we walk into a meeting, there's 10 men, 2 women. You know, there will be systems bias there, whether we like it or not, just based on comparison and these things and the way our brains work. So we have to become aware of, where is it happening? How is it limiting us all? How do we, you know, lose out on talent because of it? Does that help answer it, Claudia? It was very much spontaneous answer.
I'll keep my next question for the end.
Okay. Sarah, I was going to say, just one of the things kind of bouncing off of what you had said earlier about how a lot of gender and diversity stuff is always focused towards women and not necessarily towards men. Coming from the corporate world and actually doing trainings for people in D&I, it always felt strange to me, because it was almost like it's man-hating to talk about diversity and inclusion. Where if you are pro-woman, then you have to be anti-men. And I like the way that you've written your book to say you can be pro-women and pro-men at the same time. And that's actually where the true inclusion and diversity comes into play. So that's what was intriguing to me.
That's right. Well, thank you, Dennis. And that's the whole point. And then, of course, we've got all these other genders besides, of people who want to identify them differently. And here's the point about, and a lot of the book is just, it's about men, women as the kind of a general, but ultimately it's about how, it's a lot to do with how our minds work, sadly. We tend to work in binaries. You know, our mind works that way. So we always have to challenge ourselves as what else could be going on here? And this is obviously really important for us as coaches to be aware of. There are always alternatives. There's never two alternatives to anything. And a lot of the book talks about, you know, we're all a spectrum. We're all a mosaic of different things. We're all absolutely unique. And so this sort of this packaging of women are like this and men like that, I just, you know, I like to think, and I can imagine only every one of you in the room has the same experience if you've met enough men and women and diverse types of people that no two people are alike. And, you know, you use this example, I talk about it in the book as well, as we seem to, you know, some of these bestsellers out, I mean, they make me cringe. You know, there's this great one at the moment by Sally Helgson, Sally, who I know, she's a lovely lady, but you know, she has the 12, I can't remember it, I read it a couple of years ago and I met Sally last year, but it's about the 12, maybe one of you know, How Women Rise. She talks about the 12 things that hold women back, and there we are again, we're immediately on what's hold women back. What do women need to do to fix themselves? This is sexist, right? Why do we need to, why on earth would, where are we broken? Where are men broken? I'm not sure that's the case. What's going on here is we psychologically healthy humans, and studies have been done on this. There was a very large study done in Spain. Psychologically healthy humans have a range of masculine and feminine traits. You know, I know the only reason we talk about masculine and feminine traits, that's how our language develops, and that's again how we group and label things. But the danger comes when we start to stick people over here and people over here, and this polarizing thing that we're seeing in everything we talk about at the moment. That's why I'm really passionate about, no, we're just unique. We're all a mosaic. You know, we can all be on extremes and at any given moment. And the psychological component is really important, because what this particular study showed was that, you know, if you're very much on the female side in terms of psychological, what we talk about is how you conform to gender norms. So gender norms are the gender stereotypes, like men are supposed to be big and strong and take charge and all this stuff, and women are supposed to be nurturing and kind and empathetic. So these are gender norms that we sort of assume are natural to men and women. And much of it is, well, it's conditioning, it's nurture, it's culture, it's tradition. There's a lot of other stuff going on there. But what happens then is, well, how great is it being just a nurturer, just being a people pleaser? Well, you know, it turns out it's not that great for women, right? Turns out women really need to be agentic and in charge of their own lives, and, you know, be able to earn if they can. Who knew? Wow. And it turns out men don't just need to be in charge and kind of push everybody else around, which is this dreadful stereotype that all men seem to get labeled with. But guess what? They're nurturing and they care and they're loving. And the studies show that men are as empathetic as women. Who knew that? Well, apparently not most people. We all assume women are more empathetic than men, and we throw it out there like, you know, Dennis, you did it earlier. You said, I can't multitask. Well, guess what? Women can't multitask either. It's not possible to multitask. Yeah, you can do something in autopilot and you can do something else. No single one of us can think of two things at the same time. But we have these sort of generic things that we throw out all the time. And this is ultimately these kind of sexist statements that we kind of laugh about and we dig each other in the ribs about, but they're actually quite damaging because they're not really true. But we tend to then think we have to live up to them. And this is the part that's the psychological part. So a big part of the book is about psychological trauma and how, whilst we insist on women must be like this and men must be like this, it's not good for any of us. We need a range of skills as human beings. That we all have. So yeah, that's a really key part of the book.
Yeah, you talked about the social expectations, as you said. They expect, the society expects certain things from a woman, to dress a certain way, to act a certain way, to behave a certain way, even in the workplace. So I think this is the challenge that maybe some women may want to be different. And if we talk about uniqueness and authenticity and being yourself, and this is also important. in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody?
Any more questions, Dennis, or not?
I think we're set for now. So I'll let you continue, myself.
If you have any question, and you can ask if you don't want to type in the chat.
Did I miss something? I'm finding it hard to hear Maisa, so I'm not sure if you asked me something, Maisa.
No, I think right now we're set with questions. So Maisa, I'll turn it back over to you for the other questions that you have.
I'm curious about your journey while writing the book. What had changed for you as Sarah, like before and during and after you wrote that book? Was there any new realizations or probably new learnings? Because you interviewed a large number of people.
Yeah, so, yeah, from that.
Also tell us, for us as coaches, what role can we play in that?
I'm sorry, Maisa, it's quite difficult to hear. Did I understand right? You like, what was the journey from, writing the book? And what is it?
And also for us as coaches, how can we contribute? What is our role here?
Yeah, well, I think, okay. Well, I think, that was a key thing, because what I noticed when I was training as a coach was, again, all this kind of these little sexist throwaway things would be bandied around, and especially the advice for women: oh, women need more leadership presence, women need to do this and the other, women need to be more confident, women need to speak up, women need to sell themselves, women need to apparently do a ton of stuff. And I think it's kind of, it's what I think we need to understand when we're coaching women is, but here's the thing, right? Remember, again, leadership is incongruent from women. So when women step up, that's fine, that's great, but women we need to explain that the social context will mean that they will be penalized by some people, because there's lots of, it's not me saying it, there's tons and tons and tons of research behind this that demonstrates that when women speak up and are quite, pushy, which by the way isn't pushy, if it's the same behavior a man exhibits, but if a female exhibits it, it's seen as not likable, and people may penalize her, socially penalize her. So what does social penalization look like? Well, it can be as simple as, well, we go a bit quiet now, we don't ask any questions, or it can be wink, it can be like, we don't ask her to lunch, or, oh, she's a bit full of herself, isn't she? Or it can be like, oh no, I just don't like her for that role, let's choose such and such. So this kind of social penalization thing can happen and it's very subtle, but it happens because it's not likable behavior in women. And as long as women understand that, okay, here's the dilemma for you. Like you can speak up, absolutely, but this may happen. And just being aware of that, but then women have a choice. Because what happens, and I don't know about the rest of you ladies, but certainly my experience, and this is probably back to the journey question, Maisa, in my earlier years in the career world, I was going mad with the advice I got. Oh, Sarah, smile less. You're too attractive. Oh, Sarah, smile more. You look so miserable. Oh, Sarah, maybe you should put glasses on because you don't look very intelligent. Sarah, maybe you should tie your hair back because you look like a blonde bimbo. Or maybe you should let your hair out because, that might make you more appealing and attractive. Oh, you talk too much. Maybe you should be more quiet. Well, you really need to speak up. I mean, incessant. And so here's the thing. You can go mad with that. I'm not sure men get that much advice, but I got it constantly and it was always contradictory. And of course, the lesson is, you have to find your own way and you have to find your own authenticity. But here's the thing that's going on as well. It's like, that's a pretty lonely place if you're being contradicted and told what to do and criticized. And that's if you're lucky. Yeah, I was lucky that people would talk to me. I'm pretty outspoken, as you probably gathered. I call a spade a spade. But that doesn't often happen. So a lot of this is subconscious, and women don't understand what's going on. They don't understand why somebody maybe blanked them or somebody's overlooked them. So this understanding of it's incongruent, and there is social penalization taking place, needs to be understood when we coach women about stepping up, being confident, finding their voice, talking about their successes. These things happen. So again, it's just explaining that. And the other thing that happens is, again, we know from the research that women are held to a higher competency threshold. What does that mean? That means that if women make mistakes, and I'm sure we could think of a ton of examples from the political space, they will be punished for longer and they will be penalized harder. And again, there's research on this. There was a specific study where, I don't know, it was Jack and Jill. They weren't the names, but it was Jack and Jill, and they were both in sales, and they were both, were extremely successful, but people liked Jack a lot more than Jill. They didn't like Jill, for doing that. And then they both made the same mistake, but Jill was demoted, and Jack was kind of forgiven and then promoted. And so, and these things go on as well. So it's really being conscious of this stuff is going on. And this whole thing about leadership presence and tidying up yourself, I don't know how much of it is our business to tell people how to dress and expect in this day and age. I mean, yeah, I think ultimately we need to give people the freedom to be authentic and advise what might backfire and might not. But this idea that we have to dress in a certain way and looking a certain way and perform in a certain way, which is confident, loud as well, it backfires often for women, and I'm not sure it's the best advice in isolation. It can be good advice, but we need to provide other things there. And humility is also great. The best leaders are humble leaders. And many women are just naturally humble because we've been told not to be loud for so long that it's quite a natural state for women to be self-diminishing, a little bit quieter, tend to listen a lot more. These are tendencies we have that are to a large degree conditioned. And these are great qualities which we recognize when we say women are great leaders. These are the kind of things we talk about because we know those qualities make good leaders whenever they show up in men or women. So yeah, that what I saw a lot of was coaches just didn't understand, or they wouldn't go there. Oh, let's not go there about the gender stuff, or they'd make this sort of throwaway binary comments about how men are and how women are, and it's just not good coaching because it really isn't true. And a lot of people need to really gen themselves up on neurosexism, which is this story around, the problem is a lot of these best-selling books talk it up. Male and women brains are different. Men are like this, women are like this. And so it does proliferate. And we all have those experiences too. That's absolutely true. But they limit us, and they're not inherently intrinsically true. And so to take the brain data as an example, because I know coaches are quite into neuroscience these days, there's this term called neurosexism, and that's the plethora of information out there that does claim that our brains work so differently. Now, I was fortunate enough to have my book edited by Professor Cordelia Fine, is about one of the most famous people writing on gender at the moment. She's read the research from the last 100 years actually, unpicked much of the science behind many of these studies, which were actually biased studies, badly designed studies. There's all sorts of things going on with a lot of this neuroscientific work, which shows that it's not true. At this point, we do not have differences in male and female brains other than size, and we can identify certain things that may show up more in some men's brains and some more women's brains, but it's really not that clear. But what is clear, and this was work done by Professor Daphne Joel, who's another pretty famous lady in this field, who I also know. She has done work that has shown that while we talk about male and female brains, what she showed was, again, what the term she used, and I've stolen, this idea of all being mosaics. So she studied many brains, first of all in mice and rats and then humans. And what she found was most people have a mosaic. There's, as far as we can identify what male and female might look like in a brain, she's found mosaics. And what's very interesting is she often finds brains that are extremes of male and extremes of female. And she's found other, you know, and there's very rare where you find something supposedly a female brain or a male brain. So, you know, this is fascinating that I would encourage you all to delve more into, because a lot of these best-selling books written by the likes of Sally Helgesen, who's ultimately a journalist, some of these other people who are very sort of biased, and their work has been proven to be biased or badly designed studies. You know, delve into that a lot more, because it's all too rarely that this stuff just proliferates. It proliferates on LinkedIn, on social media. These generalizations we make about men and women that just don't have a basis. And I can get into all the sticky stuff around patriarch and why that is, but I don't really want to go there, because we've been there and we don't need to go there. We need to get out of that and talk about, no, there are undoubtedly differences, but the differences between people, and it would help us all to talk about some of our sameness at the moment, because we need to connect right now in a fairly major way in the world. And goodness knows men and women do, because we need to, you know, work together. So I'm all for recognizing what do we have in common, which is remarkably most things.
Sarah, I think Gina has a question.
Thank you. Interesting. Sarah, do you have any thoughts about language and the, you know, for the word leader? I've run women's retreats before now where we've talked about their leadership abilities, and oh, I'm not a leader. And it's almost like the word leader is loaded with a military connotation. There's so much in corporate life that's come from military and hierarchy. And you talked about initially about, you know, the idea of a leader is male and powerful and loud, and we kind of, you know, what's the word, imprinted on our brains. So it's, you know, it's like the unlearning and the unknowing, so we can be open to other kinds of leadership. But what do you think about the word leader? Is there a, you know, resistance to being a leader because of that word? Because you're talking about different forms of leadership, or a leadership where we validate what seemingly might be more feminine, compassionate, you know, the other side of the yin yang, other qualities that we'd like to see, more humble. What do you think about different terms for the word leader?
No, that's a really interesting question, Jean, and I haven't given it thought, and I am kind of passionate about language, because I know how much that affects us all as well, and how important choice of words is. Leader, frankly, I didn't come across it as like leader, the word itself. But obviously, having said that, yeah, a lot of the research, if we use the word leader, then these are the assumptions people make. You know, they draw a white male in a, you know, that's what people do. And that's what the studies in Warwick showed years ago, when indeed that professor, she ran workshops and she asked people to draw a leader, and everybody drew a big man who was white. So I can't answer that question, Gina, but I found it really intriguing. I mean, I think what obviously a lot of people bandy around other words, like, you know, servant leadership. I probably like it and dislike it. It sounds almost a bit kind of passive, but at the same time, I think it's a great word in terms of what I think leadership should be, which is really about, it's not, leadership shouldn't be about ego. And unfortunately, that's how it so often is, you know, be it in the corporate world, in politics. It's about a apparently charismatic individual with a big ego, and that's not what a leader should be. A leader should be about everybody else. That's my view of ultimately what a leader should be. Somebody who's serving other people and allowing them actually to be leaders, which I think is where we actually need to go. You know, when many more of us can be leaders, God knows we need leaders right now. So we should be promoting as many of us as possible to be leaders and to step up and retake responsibility, which of course women very often do, to be a little biased there. But of course we have been conditioned to be the caregivers and to spot things. And so that's, you know, that's a side to it too. But I find the question really interesting, Gina, and I haven't come across different terms specifically, but to your point, indeed, it needs to capture that talk about the yin and the yang and the female energy. And one of the things I delved into was the Catalyst study on, you know, these, when they asked people about what is leadership and what are the traits, you know, people gendered them and they organized them into taking care and taking charge qualities. And the majority of them were actually taking care qualities, which we naturally associate as feminine, as something women naturally have, but I would argue many men have as well. And taking charge, which was only 3 things, and I need to remember off the top of my head, but it was like delegating to others and, you know, being in control and something else. And of course, those were gendered as male, but which did we see as important? Well, apparently those 3, which proves to you how much we gender leadership, because even though this great but long list of, I think, 10 or 12 traits of female were seen as very important, is these top 3 that were regarded as male that we saw as most important in the research. So, you know, that gendering of leadership and that discussion, I think, in coaching is really valuable. It's like when we're talking about, if we're coaching anybody on leadership presence, for example, it's like, well, what does leadership mean to you? Because leadership does mean very different things to different people. And a lot of males who are really in that kind of that not toxic male necessarily, but that kind of that dominating male mindset of, I need to be responsible, I need to be in charge, will be thinking in terms of presence, gutsy, making decisions, blah, blah, blah. But another leader might be thinking in entirely different ways about what leadership is. So I think in coaching, it's important to understand, what does your client think leadership is, what's expected of them, and having this wider discussion of, well, what is leadership actually, and what is making a powerful leader? How can you show up maybe with some of these other traits that maybe you don't think you have, but that could actually be really powerful in your leadership? And so especially for men, those are those more feminine regarded as feminine traits that men may not have culturally want to utilize, because, by the way, men are also penalized, right? We penalize men if Denny starts crying now because, I don't know, you know, these things go on the other way around. And we recognize that we need kind, soft, quiet male leaders. And this is what happens to men. We put all men in the same box. It's only a big few are the bullies at the top. Sorry, my dog's going crazy. You know, the rest of the men are also humble, potentially introverted, very caring, and just have other things to bring to the table that are great in leadership. So I think when we're coaching people, we need to keep these, how we've gendered leadership in mind, and these traits, and encourage the sex we have in front of us to discuss that and identify what do they have, and not assume that women are necessarily not prepared to be, you know, I'm kind of a bit gutsy and gun-ho-y, and it's what I'm known for. I don't hold back, and I know I'm not liked for it. But when I achieve things and people see I really care about them and I bring them all along, then they like me. And it takes time. And that's just, you know, that's something at the age of 50 now almost I'm very comfortable with. But, you know, it was a struggle at 25. But, you know, so that's just my personal example. But those are the situations where we need to, when we're coaching, who do we have in front of them? What are their unique skills? How much might they be buried or limited by the social context they're in that particular moment? And males, and it's a shame we don't have more men, but I've seen so often men giving women's advice to women, which would apply very well to themselves, but women can't get away with it, you know, in isolation. They've got to have the context of why that might backfire for them, and understand, well, who's going to support them and how and so on. So yeah, that's you know, that's key.
Sarah, we've got a question from Jesse.
Hi, Sarah. So I work in law firms. I work with lawyers and law firms, and it is an extremely white male dominated industry, which knows intellectually that it has a diversity problem, but isn't actually taking the steps that I believe are necessary to change it. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to actually help law firms get better. What do you think needs to happen to really change the status quo? I agree with you that, you know, the stereotypes just don't apply, and everybody is more than what they're defined as. But you know, when it comes down to change and bringing people along and having things change from the inside out, because I do think it is the white men who need to change. We can't expect women to do all of the work, or minorities to do all of the work of change. We have to get the white men to change. So what do you say? How do we do that?
Yeah, and that again is ultimately what who this book is written for.
Yeah.
You know, you know about that carefully, because how many white men are going to read it realistically? Right. So, but you're right, Jessie, because what it is because what I noticed in law firms is just a great example, because it's so, you know, I work with law firms before, and as a former lawyer, I know it from personal experience. So you've got, and you know, law, I mean, these are strong women as well. So you've got a lot of that masculine agentic stuff just going on. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean it's all toxic or anything, but it's highly competitive. And whilst you've got this gender norm of, oh, men need to win, which is a gender norm that many, many men buy into, you know, men are threatened by strong women. A lot of men are feeling uncomfortable if a woman is in charge, or you know, because of this need to win that's been sort of conditioned in our little boys, and so they grow up, and on some conscious or subconscious level that's still there. So yeah, you have to tippy toe around this stuff. And so I think a large way to do it is about bringing this subject. No, sexism affects everyone. You know, stereotyping affects everyone. It's as bad for men as for women. And but yeah, there's and often it's one-on-one. It's tricky to get a pile of men in the room, and that's the biggest challenge. But you know, this one-on-one kind of approach, it works well. So it's an approach I've always had in everything I've done in my work. You know, one conversation at a time, but helping men understand they're not being blamed. It's not their fault. It's nothing they do, but because they will recognize very quickly that when we talk about the gender, and that's why I coach on the gender norms part, because that's a really key bit. When men realize how much gender norms hurt them, and because all gender norms are contradictory for us both, and gender norms develop over time. So, you know, the gender norms of 20 years ago are not the gender norms now. And for men, gender norms are very contradictory at the moment. You've got to still wear pants, go out, make the money, drive the fancy car, but actually now you've got to stay at home, hold the baby, feed it, blah, blah. You know, so these contradictions are going on as well. So men are also going through this sort of sensitive period of what is my role? How am I supposed? And that's why you see this backlash from some sort of the toxic males, like men need to be men and women need to know the, you know, all that's going on. So there's kind of this one conversation at a time talking about gender norms. And, you know, to get to more people quickly, you know, sadly to say, but HR and women need to grasp this. We've got to, I mean, I'm all for, when I run my course, I'm really like, yeah, sure, lady, you can come on it, but you have to bring a man. It's the only way the course works. This is not a women's conversation. This is an everyone conversation. So bring a guy. And yeah, at this point, I mean, I was on a women's, I'm sure you know, one of the most sort of the global women's network thing last week. And again, it was full of women, and we were talking about the same stuff that they were talking about 3 years ago. It's like, okay, this is a broken record. Let's move on. We need men in this conversation at every point. So yeah, Jessie, it's like, yeah, you've got to break into HR and have these conversations with them, because when you have these conversations, people get it, and men do feel involved. And how to get men in the room, how to get to men to have these conversations, how to help them understand they're not under threat. And actually what happens there was men weed themselves out. You know, the toxic males, which are the bane of everyone else's life, they are few. And when everybody else groups together, the bullies, which is ultimately what they are, they get weeded out. But that's the point. Bullying is a group phenomenon. It's not a bully and a victim, which in this situation might be a toxic male and a little female who wants to climb the hierarchy. It's a group dynamic. So what we need is the group to say, what's acceptable? What do we want? Okay, we want equality. Why do we want that? Because guess what? those are the best places to work. We have enough years now of great places to work data, and, you know, diverse, inclusive places produce 20% higher returns for stakeholders. You know, we've got loads of evidence now it works. So it's in everybody's interest. So incentivizing your high performers to do this stuff as part of their leadership development, as part of their succession planning, is also, I think, a very strategic way to play it right now, to say, look, these are the leaders we want. We need people modeling this, because this does come from the top. We can get to HR, and HR can be more strategic, and coaches can be strategic. But leaders have to model this stuff as, this is the norm now. This is what we do. We promote men and women. And this is how we're going to do it. So we've got to identify those men who are really comfortable with, and not the sort of dumb rhetoric, oh yeah, I have a daughter, so I should think about this. And you know, there's an awful lot of that going on as well. It doesn't begin to get into it. It's like, get to the meat of it, which is the psychological distress, the trauma that makes being apparently masculine or feminine difficult for all of us. Get to that juicy topic straight away, because when you get to that, everybody gets it, and you move quickly. Yeah, but you have to go there.
I think one of the challenges of making this change, again, is I think that a lot of men, from my experience in corporate, has been, we've been kind of fed this idea that diversity inclusion is for women, it's not for men. So when something around diversity or inclusion comes up, I really don't need to deal with it because I'm a man, and that's more of a women's issue. And I think just looking at the audience today,
yeah, and this is the problem.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges is helping men understand that this is it's a partnership, is how we create this this inclusion. It's not these two separate things, and they've got to figure out one way, the women over here and the men over here, and then somehow everything will kind of work together. It doesn't. As long as there are these separate silos, it's never going to work.
And I do want to know what Jesse's impression is of the answer, but I would add one more thing as well, Jesse, because it's my constant experience now that the great irony very often is, you know, these women's networks and some of the people in HR, they are the assimilated females. And what does that mean? They're the ones who said, no, I had to work harder and longer and fight more to get here. So I don't have sympathy with you. I'm going to help you get to these men. This is how it is. Some women succeed, most don't. And that's a big problem. Women are a huge problem in getting equality for women. They're not the only problem. And the other problem is, yeah, men still have this, you know, culturally, again, in the research, you know, we see in suicide rates, in unemployment, in so many things around women that yeah, I should talk about. I'm so impassioned about, you know, having 3 older brothers and a son and a husband, you know, there is huge pressure still on men to be the breadwinner, to be the earner, to be the responsible guy, to have the big job. And whilst we do that, whilst we have that situation, yeah, how are women going to get there? If we're saying to men, no, you have to be the leader and in charge, that's also kind of counterintuitive. But hang on a minute, what you want women to be? But I've got to have this woman as my boss. You know what I mean? So all of that stuff has to be really got at.
I absolutely resonate with the issue of women being horrible to other women. You know, I worked really hard. You're going to have to work hard too. Like, that just defeats everything, right? And it's not that you need to make it easy, especially in the law, right? You have to earn your, you know, it is a meritocracy, but it doesn't have to be traumatic. And I completely agree that we have to hold them. You know, we got to convince the men who can be convinced that it's in their interest to make change. I think I unfortunately agree with you that it is probably you have to get them one at a time, chip away at it before you get, you know, some critical mass going.
And this holding accountability, you know, I mean, I'll freely say it on this call, but there are men in this book who are absolutely, you know, I know from first experience in terms of how they interact with me, how they've promoted women, how they've spoken at events. You know, they're rare, but they're there, and those are absolutely those are the type of men you need to target. There's also a ton of men in this book who you know, there's not a ton of men in this book, but there's a couple of salient ones. I won't say more, but you know, fairly high profile there. That there's tokenism. You know, they despite what they say, I've seen it. I've even seen it firsthand with how we've dealt with this book. It's lip service, and they're not stepping up. So don't go for the ones that say, oh yeah, we should be doing this kind of important. Go for the ones who are really demonstrating every day. Yeah, no, I'm going to get Jessie's going to do this today. Of course, she's the right one for the job. You really need to target the ones who really have demonstrated it, and they will be few. But they are the example, not the ones who give lip service. And likewise for the women, there's a lot of women who talk about this, but it's lip service. And unfortunately, a lot of this women network stuff, these are lip service women who absolutely throw every hurdle at you because they feel threatened. Because what are we talking about here as well? When we talk about identity, if people identify very strongly with a male or female thing, you're kind of clinging to that because that's ego again, right? That's part of that makes me, and I'm special, and it's who I am. And there's a lot of that going on in this conversation. And unfortunately, by a lot of women who apparently, allegedly fight for equality, but actually aren't. They're fighting for sort of, I don't know what they're fighting for sometimes, but when I see a comment like, oh, the day men lead like women, we'll all be saved. It's just sexist nonsense. It's not helpful. It's not helpful rhetoric, I think.
Sarah, Trish had a question for you. She unfortunately had to drop off the call for another call though, but she was asking, what would you say are some of the gems from the book that go beyond generics? Things that would be really useful for coaches, so stuff that we can work with our clients.
Sure. So the stuff around gender norms is an absolute go-to, and I think for any coaching, because I think it shows up so much in everybody's everyday behavior, how gendered we are in our behaviors. You know, when we show up in the social context, these things just play out for all sorts of reasons, but they're very often limiting, and especially if we're not aware of them. So, you know, digging into the gender norms and having those discussions with clients, I think is really valuable. Again, talking about what does leadership mean to you personally, to your context and the people who are leading you, because they'll all have different nuances. What else? Oh, there's so many things. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of research. Yeah, the neurosexism discussion, I think, is a very important one, because most people you talk to will make these statements that just are not true about men and women, about sex, gender, about our apparent so-called abilities. They're not true, and that's a really important one because that just pervades. So I don't think any of that's generic, because I haven't come across it in other material. I come across lots of women are amazing and like this, but women need to do all these things to change. And there's some of the system stuff out there, but not a great deal. And men are silent. So the key thing is pushing for men and getting men involved as well. Yeah.
You had mentioned earlier about your course. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So that is, yeah, so I have two courses actually. So the one's just been accredited, the other one's about to be. So they're both accredited by the International Coach Federation. And this one for the sort of more of the leadership actually. Well, it's gender and leadership. So gender dimensions in leadership course. It's 22 CCEUs, we call them, don't we? 11 core competency points and 11 resource development points. And so just go into detail, and it's training coaches, which could be anybody, frankly, from coaches to leaders to MBA students to whoever. Those are the targets, because obviously I think this applies to everybody. This isn't something coaches specifically need, or you know, everybody needs to understand these skills and how much they proliferate and affect us all. So yeah, and then we dig into, well, how would you coach on this specific issue, and so it's a step by step. So it's basically it's a large part of it's reading portions of the book, and then there are 8 live calls, 6 of which are compulsory to get the core competency points along with sort of coursework. And then the other course, which is about to be accredited, is a slightly shorter one, so slightly sort of cleaner for probably DE&I purposes, and that's called Creating Diverse, Equitable and Inclusive Leaders, and that I'm doing with a colleague who's Black African American male. So we are the face of what we think diversity and inclusion is all about. So trying to represent whatever aspects of groupings that is missing from the table. So we guide through the various issues around owning privilege and succession planning, and how to really nurture your talent so that you get diverse pool of people, and you make sure you include everybody in that. A lot behind perceptual and behavioral coaching, again, gender norms. So yeah, all sorts of things. So, and that course is I try to remember off the top of my head, but I think it's about 15 CCUs. It's at least 10 core competency points as well.
Okay.
So,
and then where's the schedule for these? Is this on your website?
Yeah, or you can contact me directly. The second one's not up yet because we're waiting for the accreditation, which will probably come in weeks. But the first one, yeah, is up, the gender dimension.
Great. And if you look in the chat, everyone, I've put the link to Sarah's book again. We had it at the very beginning of the call, but I put it in again just for your reference there. And it looks like Misa is having some network problems and got kicked out of the call, even though she's the host. So do we have any other questions from the audience that you want to ask Sarah?
And by all means, yeah, Misa was probably going to mention it, but obviously as something kind of special for Coaches for Good, the access to the talk, access to the course, you can contact me directly, but it's at a grossly discounted rate for anybody should you wish to partake in an upcoming one. I think we're until at least March, but yeah, that's something Excellent. That.
Thanks for offering that, Sarah.
Just contact me about that. I can let you know about that.
Okay, so any last questions? Claudia, you said you had one more question that you wanted to ask, or was that question answered during the course of the session?
If the internet allows me.
Yes.
If the internet allows me, I've been in and out. So if there was one thing that you would like us to take away from your book, I haven't read your book, so it's like, what would that be at the end of me reading the book? What would you like me to take away from your book?
Well, I think it's a lot of what we talked about, Claudia, which is, this is a conversation this needs to be an inclusive conversation for everyone. Equality in leadership and equality in gender. And so you also need to approach it from other people's perspectives, not just our own, not just our own sex, not just our own color. Yeah, I think it's very comprehensive in covering a lot of the issues around inclusivity and also about how we create a belonging, because people have finally twigged to the fact that you only have an inclusive workplace or any situation when people feel they belong. So there's a lot in there about how do you engage people and how do people psychologically feel they belong. So that's I think it's hard to say one thing, Claudia, to be honest. there's a lot in it. It's a very comprehensive, it covers a lot of stuff. So it's a good, of course I would say that, but it is a really good resource that covers a lot of different topics in this whole DE&I discussion. And it's all, and you come at it from a coaching and a leadership perspective. So Yeah, I'm not really sure. What would be your answer, Dennis, having been through more of it than most?
I think for me, it goes back to, this has to be something that everyone is included in the conversation. That it's not a gender-based conversation, it's an organizational-based conversation. The issues that we have are organization-wide, and we need to come together as an organization, regardless of the gender, and answer or come up with the answer to the question there. I think that's what I would come away with. And it looks like we are coming down to the end. Are there any last questions that anyone wants to ask? Gina, you have one more question? No? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Sarah, for
Pleasure.
sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Nice to meet you, Jessie. Nice to
Likewise. Have a good day. Thanks.